Well, we were talking about holding people accountable with the Deputy Speaker in the National Assembly just a few moments ago. This week, Transparency International revealing how South Africa has fallen down the list of the International Corruption Perceptions Index. The list also suggests that a weakening justice system, or weakening justice systems around the country, around the world rather, are allowing a lack of accountability. In other words, there's more corruption because criminal justice systems aren't working properly. Robert Mwanyumba is the Africa Regional Advocacy Coordinator and Regional Advisor for Southern Africa for Transparency International. Robert, good afternoon to you. What is going on that's making South Africa fall further down the list? Why are we doing worse than we did before?
Good afternoon, Stephen. Thanks for having me on the show. I mean, what's happening in South Africa, unfortunately, is a trend that we're seeing globally. And one of the things that seems to be sticking out is the fact that we have seen a decline in democratic space, which has continued to undermine civic space, accountability and transparency in public transactions. So South Africa, like a lot of other countries across the globe, unfortunately, has seen declines in the democratic space, which has had a very direct impact on its ability to dispense justice. In this case, we have seen, unfortunately, a decline in this whole South Africa because of this trend that unfortunately seems to be encompassing the entire globe, which is a decline in democratic space and access to justice.
Robert, I mean, why is this happening? Off the top of my head, I would think of several things. One is, what happened during COVID was that countries did become less democratic. It just became harder to hold people accountable. I think something else might have happened in the private sector. The more money you had, the more capital you had, the more you could just get away with because people were concentrating on other things. I mean, does that get us some of the way there?
Unfortunately, it does. And the truth is, what happens, and I'm happy that you reflected on it since the COVID pandemic, because then when we had a lot of restricted space, civic space, what then happened is we tended to see a lot of decisions being made in less than transparent manner. And what that unfortunately led to is when there were no when there was insufficient investment in public oversight bodies and there was this lack of transparency, the signal that sent out is that corrupt individuals could actually get away with it without being held accountable. And that has a long sort of stain on it when you're looking at the fact that it affects not just law enforcement agencies, but you also affect the judiciary and other prosecutorial agencies. That capture of legal mechanisms unfortunately has a spillover effect that leads very much to injustice. And in this case, we have seen the breakdown in the rule of law contributing towards corruption, and corruption actually eroding the rule of law and further alienating equal access to justice or accountability by those who wield power.
It can take quite a long time to increase accountability, but you can go backwards quite quickly.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, the slip back tends to be one that is quite fast. And some of the trends that we're seeing across the continent is some countries that have been able to strengthen their judicial systems are only a regime away from a crisis or a catastrophe. And therefore, I think it also becomes very important then to strengthen your civic space and empower citizens to be able to hold their leaders to account, because in the failure of accountability mechanisms, both those that have legitimate mandate but also citizens pushing, then those that tend to be corrupt are able to purchase privileges which would otherwise be available to everyone else, especially those that are merited to have access to those opportunities. But then they create a sort of two-tier system that continues to disenfranchise the majority of the population.
Robert, do examples matter? And what I mean is many people will look at the United States as the world's oldest continuous democracy. It's gone through periods of incredible incredible corruption during that process. It was sort of democratic, but had slavery, for example. I mean, it's incredible. There was a Gilded Age where you saw business people just get away with making huge fortunes and abusing people. And then it went through a long period of a sort of deepening democracy, and that reversed in the last few years. Donald Trump's the best example of that. I would argue the same happened in the UK during COVID. You saw sort of government corruption along, procurement and things like that. When people look at those countries sort of going backwards as well, does that have an impact on other countries? I realize it's a slightly strange question, but I wonder if democracies affect democracies.
I think you're absolutely correct, because the signaling that happens when sort of democracies that were held in high regard tend to regress. The problem is the signal that sends out is that some people, even within mature democracies, can get away with acts of corruption. That being said, we have seen some of the strongest countries that continue to score in the top 10, such as Sweden, over the last 10 years decline with respect to their average score. That, for me, is a signaling on one end. But we've also seen the reverse. So countries such as Angola and Mozambique have actually begun to improve because of some of the steps that have been taken to strengthen their democratic institutions. And some of these basic steps include, properly resourcing your judiciary, getting enough oversight agencies who are putting out reports that have been acted on, and actually strengthening your own national systems. So for me, the question is, it's not just what the signals do, but what is the element of sovereignty and what can then be done within a nation state. That being said, unfortunately, sometimes corruption tends to be transboundary, and if you have a jurisdiction such as the US or the UK playing a facilitatory role towards corruption, then that tends to endear those that are powerful or within positions of power to abuse, because they know that either something wouldn't be done on the other end where they store or hide their money, or they get the services that they need to from those corrupt institutions that facilitate the acts of corruption.
Robert Mwanyumba, thank you. Africa Regional Advocacy Coordinator and Regional Advisor for Southern Africa for Transparency International.